And Robert, I will turn things over to you.
All righty, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know this is some exciting times we're experiencing. Getting some kind of feedback here. I don't know if it's me. Excuse me.
There, I think everybody's muted now.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Good, because that was one of the announcements I'm going to make to make sure that everybody have their microphone muted when you're not speaking. This way we're not getting feedback like we were just getting a few minutes ago. Okay. Again, thank you everybody for coming in. I know this is some exciting times that we're experiencing, and this is a new way of meeting for the Financial Aid Advisor Committee team committee.
Robert, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just got a text from Heidi. She can't get in. Chad, can you send her the link again, Heidi Granger? Sorry about that. I apologize.
Okay.
Chad, I can send it. Oh, there's someone in the lobby. Is that her?
Carla Flores is now joining. Carla Flores is now exiting.
Okay, Robert, why don't you go ahead and start again?
Okay. All right. Welcome again, everybody. Thank you for coming. Before we start, we have a few announcements. Hopefully, we'll make our meeting go the best we can. The first item is that we are being streamed live via YouTube. So if you're on camera, please watch what you're doing. Second, please mute your microphone when not speaking. This way, we eliminate any feedback. We will establish a quorum before we start the meeting. The voting will be done by roll call. The quorum will be established also by roll call. Please identify yourself before you speak for the record. Also, wait until one person's finished talking before you speak. And if possible, use the raise hand feature. I know some of you are calling in, so this may be difficult, but please announce yourself before you speak. Handouts will not be displayed during the meeting, but they are available at the agency's website at the address displayed at the bottom of the current slide. The address will also be displayed at the start of each agenda item. We will take a 10-minute break around 10:30. And I think we'll go ahead and establish a quorum. So would I please call your name? When I call your name, please present yourself, announce yourself. Tacey Anderson.
Good morning, this is Tacey.
Good morning, Tacey. Dr. Ben Bowen.
Good morning, this is Ben Bowen.
Shannon Crossland.
Good morning, this is Shannon Crossland.
Carla Flores. I think she didn't get back in. Okay. Paul, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your names, but I'll do my best. Paul Gallion.
That's perfect. This is Paul Gallion from Jacksonville, Texas.
Good. Rochelle Garrett.
This is Rochelle Garrett.
Heidi Granger.
This is Heidi Granger. I'm here.
Lynn Keon.
This is Lynn. I'm here.
Okay. Tam Nguyen.
Good morning. This is Tom Nguyen.
Shauna Norton.
Good morning. This is Shauna Norton.
Thomas Ratliff.
Hello, everyone. This is Thomas.
Samantha Stalnaker.
Hi, everyone. It's Samantha Stoniger.
Kelly Stillman.
Good morning, everyone. This is Kelly.
Dr. Christine Stewart-Carruthers.
Good morning, this is Christine. I'm here.
Okay. Dr. Joy Thomas.
Good morning. This is Joy.
Dr. Foreman Thompson.
Good morning. This is Foreman.
Denise Welch.
Good morning. This is Denise Welch.
Brent Wilfor.
Good morning, it's Brent.
And also we have a new student joining us, Jace. I'm going to chop your name, I'm sure. Kuya. It looks like we have a quorum, so we can begin the meeting. So the first item on the agenda is introduction of Jace. Jace is a student from UT Austin. So Jace, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jace Kugia. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm studying higher education leadership. I'm originally from Honolulu, Hawaii, but my educational journey has taken me across the country. I went to a small school in Washington State. I got my master's at the University of Michigan, and I'm excited to be here with all of you and be a very valued contributor to the advisory committee. So it's nice to meet you all.
Good. Welcome, Jace. Okay, the next item on the agenda is acknowledgement of the members who are finishing their term. And we just announce to you, usually we have a certificate to present to you. I don't know if you can see, but my certificate we're going to have to sign and bring, I guess, at the next meeting so that Ed and Diane and I can sign them. But once we sign them, we'll mail them to you. But we'll go ahead and announce the names of those members who are finishing their terms. Stacy Anderson, Shannon Crossland, Carla Flores, Lynn Kenyon, Shauna Norton, although she is, I believe, had been nominated to return. Diane Tasprog, she's finishing the PES chair. Samantha Snalker, Christine Stewart-Carruthers, and Brent Willipore. So all those candidates, all those members are finishing their term. I really appreciate everything you have done for the committee. I know your feedback has been valuable. It really helped us ensure that the coordinator board is representing our interest. Chad, would you like to say something?
I just want to repeat what you've mentioned. I really appreciate all the contributions that you've all made. When I looked at the list, I kind of was surprised that 3 years have gone by for some of you that you've been a part of this committee. And so I really appreciate what you've contributed, and I look forward to us being able to continue to work with you, even though you won't be on the committee anymore.
Okay, good. The next item on the agenda is consideration of approval of the minutes from the March 5th meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the meetings, the minutes?
So moved. Denise
I'm sorry.
Welch.
So I have a motion made by Denise Welch. Do I have a second?
Seconded.
I'm sorry. Can you please announce your name?
There were two of us. Heidi
Okay.
Granger was
Okay.
one.
Heidi. Okay, we'll go and take you, Heidi.
Thank
so
you.
I have a second made by Heidi Granger. Okay. All right. So now we will vote if there's no discussion. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go down the line. Down the row. Tacy.
Yes.
Okay. Ben.
Yes, approve.
Shannon.
Yes.
Carla. Oh, she's not here. Paul,
Yes.
Rochelle,
Yes, sir.
Heidi, come back. Lynn,
Yes.
Tam,
Yes.
Shauna,
Yeah. Yes.
Thomas,
Yes.
Samantha,
Yes.
Kelly,
Yes.
Christine,
Yes.
Joy,
Yes.
Foreman,
Yes.
Denise,
Yes.
Brent,
Yes.
Jace,
Hello. Sorry.
Ed,
Approve.
Diane,
Sorry, my mouse sticks sometimes. Approved.
and approve this as well. Chad, do you also approve?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So other than Heidi, are you back? Okay.
Yes, I am. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yes, I approve as well.
Okay. All right. So the motion passes with unanimous vote. Okay. The next item on the agenda is prior businesses. Chad.
Sorry, I started talking without unmuting myself. One thing I wanted to mention before I started talking about prior business is that I just got an email from Carla. She is in the meeting. She's just having microphone issues. So she can hear us. We just can't hear her. So hi, Carla. So in terms of prior business, the one item of prior business that was carried forward from a previous agenda item was just some additional information for you that we compiled based on requests for details about FAFSA filing habits across the population. At the last meeting, we had provided you with handouts that showed the timing of when FAFSAs were filed for individuals who had received the major grant programs, Texas Grant, TEOG, and TEG. And starting on page 8 of the handout materials, we now have additional charts for you so that there are charts both for those who received funding as well as charts for just individuals that appear to have been eligible for funding. So it captures people that based on the FAD data, it appears that they had eligibility for the funding regardless of whether or not they received that. And so we wanted to continue to provide data to you so that you all can continue to think about the FAFSA filing deadline and whether or not there's other information that you would like the coordinating board to assemble for you and whether there is any additional conversation that we'd like to have at a future meeting once you've had a chance to kind of dig into this and ask any other questions about it. The one chart that, in looking at these, as I took a look at them, the patterns seem to be relatively the same between when you're looking at people who received funding versus people who didn't receive funding. There's not a significant difference between the patterns in the two populations, though when you look at the EFC patterns, you do see a bit of heightened filing later on people with higher EFCs, it appears, for people that are above the Pell eligible EFC. But anyways, that was a question that had been asked, so we wanted to follow up and provide you with that information. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about those handouts, or hear of any other things that you would like us to look into in relation to that information. Hearing nothing else?
No, no, I would just say thank you for the information. Anybody have any feedback, comments for Chad? Appears not, Chad.
Okay, well, Robert, why don't you go on to the next?
Okay. All right, so the next item on the agenda.
Oh, I think we just have a unmuted person. Okay.
Okay. So the next item on the agenda is external relations. John White, Senior Director of External Relations, will bring us some information. I know one of the questions we had was about the Texas Governor's Emergency Educational Relief Fund. So, John.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm John Wyatt. I'm a Director of External Relations here at the Coordinating Board. Let me apologize in advance if a couple of grade schoolers bust through this door behind me. We're all making do these days. So I'm going to present an update on some of the activities we've been engaged in during the interim in preparation for the legislative session, and I am going to talk about the GEAR funds. And then I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all might have. So to start out, as you're all probably aware, back during the summer, all state agencies and institutions were instructed to prepare a 5% reduction scenario for their current year budgets. So for the FY 2021 fiscal biennium. Now, for the coordinating board, that would have meant a $57 million reduction across our three major state financial aid programs, those being Texas Grant, TEOG, and TEG. At the time, we estimated that over 13,000 students would have been impacted in the current biennium by that reduction. Commissioner Keller worked very closely with Governor Abbott and legislative leadership to avoid that reduction. He argued that reducing support for financially needy students at this time would not only derail their progress, but also it would hinder the state's economic recovery. We're very grateful that Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, Speaker Bonin, legislative leaders were receptive to that argument. And what they ended up doing was they dedicated $57 million from, it's called the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, toward those financial aid programs. The GEAR Fund is a part of the Federal CARES Act, which was federal stimulus legislation passed back in May. So because of that $57 million investment, those three financial aid programs will continue at their FY 2021 appropriated level. So essentially, it's a hold safe for the current biennium. Now, on top of that, state leaders also committed another $93 million from the GEAR Fund to support Texas students impacted by COVID-19. Now, that funding was divided into kind of two tranches. So the first half, about the $46.5 million, is being distributed to institutions, to public institutions for emergency educational grants for new and continuing students. So the idea with these funds is to provide kind of quick, flexible financial assistance to undergraduates who are experiencing some sort of COVID-related hardship. to keep them on track. The second tranche of that funding, I'm sorry, and for that initial tranche, we have already sent out contracts to all eligible institutions, and those funds are being dispersed as we get the executed contracts back. So that should allow those institutions to serve their students for fall of 2020. So the second tranche, that other $46.5 million, is going to be used to assist displaced Texas workers who need to reskill or upskill, as well as Texans who stopped out with some credit but no credential. So those getting those kind of adult workers back into higher education so they can reskill, upskill, get a credential, and contribute to their families and to our state economy. In that tranche, priority is going to be placed on students pursuing credentials in high demand fields. The coordinating board is currently working on our legislative appropriations request for the next biennium, so for fiscal year 22-23. The difficulty is that we have been instructed that our budget for next year has to incorporate that 5% reduction that we had to take this year. But the GEAR funds were a one-time federal investment. So that managed to cover us in the current biennium. There's going to have to be some careful consideration given to how we're going to continue to support financial aid in the next biennium. So that's kind of where we stand in terms of budgeting. In terms of the legislature, normally at this time, we'd be having interim hearings. We'd be testifying and discussing ways to address higher education needs. Obviously, COVID-19 kind of scrapped those plans. And what the House has done is, instead of having hearings, they have posted several requests for information relevant to interim charges. And so we have provided the House committee with information that hopefully will help them address those interim charges. One of those was the COVID-19 pandemic, how your agency has been impacted and how we are responding to coronavirus. In our response, we highlighted the GEAR funds as an important way of addressing needs arising out of coronavirus. We also highlighted the Texas Higher Education Foundations. The Texas Higher Education Foundations work with Greater Texas Foundation and Trellis on the Texas Emergency Aid Grants Program. If you're not familiar with this is an initiative that we launched back pretty early on during the coronavirus pandemic to raise funds through philanthropy to make emergency aid grants to students. So we had initial anchor funding of $711,000. And we're able to make emergency aid allocations to 57 institutions as a result of that. Grants varied from about $10,000 to $20,000 and were prioritized based on financial need. The foundation is continuing to work to raise additional philanthropy to support those efforts, with the goal of continuing to make additional awards to institutions so that you can support your students with emergency aid. And then just to give you a little preview of session, so the 87th Texas session is set to convene on January 12th of next year. There are honestly just a lot of unanswered questions regarding what session is going to look like, how the legislature is going to function, given the health and safety precautions that are going to need to be taken. And the questions extend throughout the legislative process. I know that House and Senate leaders are very carefully thinking about, how do you conduct business in a Capitol office? How do you have hearings and conduct committee business? How do you have session on the floor while still trying to maintain a safe environment for lawmakers, for staff, and for the public? And kind of the indication that we've gotten is that we can expect this session to be pretty different from sessions we've seen in the past. It looks like the process is going to be slower because of the kind of things that they're going to have to do to maintain safety standards. but the specifics of that are still to be determined. But whatever those arrangements are, the commitment that Commissioner Keller has, that our agency has, remains the same. That is, we're going to provide lawmakers with objective and insightful data and analysis. We're going to do everything we can to assist them in the decisions that they're going to have to make regarding higher education policy and funding. And so that's just my kind of quick overview from where I stand. But I'm happy to answer any questions or field any comments y'all might have.
Are there any questions for what, John?
I have one, I guess. This is Shauna Norton. When you talk about the direct student support for this year, that priority will be replaced on students pursuing credentials in high demand fields. Is there a specific list of those, or are those just the generally accepted high demand fields?
Well, Chad may have more information on this, but I know that portion of it, I think we're still working on. Is that right, Chad?
Yes, right now, our division for academic quality and workforce is putting together the concepts of how that's going to be defined, what would be included within that. So they're still working to determine exactly those pieces, but once that is defined, information will be sent out to institutions accordingly.
So students who maybe didn't start in the fall because of COVID-19 could potentially start in the spring semester, since a lot of schools have already started all of their programs, if they qualified for this.
Yes, I think that's a possibility. I know that portion of the funding is still really being worked through to figure out the specifics of it. Two of the three portions of the funding to help support the Texas grant, TEOG and TEG, as well as the funding to support the emergency educational grants. Those contracts have already been sent to institutions, and we're starting to process the return contracts so we can disperse those funds so that institutions can begin using that funding this fall. The emergency educational grant is specifically for this fall term. Funding has to be expended during the fall semester. But the upskilling and reskilling funding, that $46.5 million, they're still very much figuring out the best mechanism as to how to utilize that. I know that, when it comes to some of that certificate pieces and things like that, that those may have different start dates throughout the semester, depending on the shorter term programs, et cetera. So that's still very much being worked out right now.
Okay, thank you.
I'll also add, I believe there's a document provided in your materials that's an overview of the GEAR funding. I just spoke about the financial aid component, but there are some additional components to this. There's funding to support online education and open source educational materials. There's some funding for data infrastructure. So all told, the governor invested about $175 million from the GEAR fund into higher education.
Okay. John, this is Diane. Quick question. We are, of course, appreciative of the monies. The turnaround time, of course, is a little hard. We're having to really scramble to get this together. But I do have a question, and I'm assuming that we will be getting further guidance as we go along and exchange phone calls with Deshay and others at the coordinating board. I'm a little confused about the differences in the approach between, so the federal government gave the state CARES money. The federal government dictated how we spent CARES money very differently than how the state is saying that we should be spending the CARES money. So so they've given the state this money and then said, okay, now you can put your criteria on top of that, it's confusing. Do you have any guidance on this or insight?
Well, I can tell you from the CARES Act perspective, there was the pot of money that went directly to institutions, right?
Right.
That had to be 50% emergency aid, 50% you had more flexibility with.
Right.
And then the GEAR funds, went to the state. And I know from the federal goal was to provide maximum flexibility to states in terms of how they use that funding between public education and higher education. As long as it supported education impacted by COVID, that it was pretty much allowable. So I can't speak to decisions that were undertaken specifically about the eligibility or the requirements of the GEAR funds. Maybe Chad, you might have some impact.
Well, I think a key piece to point out is that while the HEAR funds went directly to the institutions, the GEAR funds went to the governor. And then the governor's office determined all the different ways that it might be used to support education. And that's all of education, K through 12, as well as higher education. And so, as the governor worked through that process, for example, he did provide to the agency funding to support specific items. So in that handout, you'll see that a set of funding was provided to support the agency so that we can help support online learning. Another piece was the support for the Texas grants, TEG and TEOG. Two other items were the emergency educational grant, as well as the upskilling and reskilling funds. So the GEAR funds are very different from the HEAR funds in the sense that they go through the governor's office, and the governor's office determines how those funds are going to be apportioned to various different projects that are going to support education. In terms of the emergency education grant program, our chief of staff did convene a small group of institutions to provide us with some input on those emergency educational grants. Those funds, the goal of that program was very specific. The goal was to help address situations to keep students in school. So whereas the upskilling and reskilling funding is going to be focusing on bringing students who haven't been in school back into school for them to complete credentials, the emergency educational grant was very specifically focused on students who had been enrolled this past year or were just starting their educational careers coming out of high school, and helping ensure that they could stay enrolled for the fall semester. So it did have a very specific focus.
And I do really appreciate all of that. And again, we are very appreciative of the money. I do have one other question. Because this was announced just recently to the institutions, I mean, I got the notice Saturday in my email. I understand that the intent was to spend the money this fall. I would say that the November 2nd deadline seems interesting to me because the semester is going to go through December. And I will tell you that we are scrambling to get this going. And it's complicated because we're having to explain to the students the differences. We have emergency grant monies on our institution from our institutional programs. We still have a little bit of CARES money, and now we have this money. And so we have these things out there that we have to explain to students. Okay, you group, you go here. You group, you go here. You group, you go here. It's very complicated. And so I don't know if there's any opportunity to extend beyond November 2nd, but I would say if we have any breathing room till the end of the fall, that would be extremely helpful.
And that's something that we can definitely look at as the semester continues. I know that The concept with the November date was to make sure that should there be institutions that aren't able to use all of their funding, that funding could be reapportioned to other institutions to make sure that everything is spent by the end of the fall. Because what we don't want to happen is we get to the end of the fall semester and there's a bunch of this funding left over that hasn't been used. So that's what we're trying to balance, is a date that provides institutions with the time to award these funds, but also provides us with the ability to take any unused funds and provide it to institutions who can make use of the funds.
This is Ed Curresley. Just a few thoughts, on all of this with the GEAR funds. First of all, do appreciate the guidance, the Q&A that has been provided, and even come out today to kind of respond to the questions that we've had. Related to that, and kind of tagging on to what Diane is saying, my hope is that this is not guidance that continues to be fluid. That is probably one of the biggest frustrations with the CARES Act funds, is that we were working under one set of principles and then they came out with another set of principles and another set of principles. And, so do hope that, kind of the guidance that we've been given is solid moving forward. And unless there is really need for, change. I do have a question about the dates that have been established as well. First of all, this discussion about the emergency grant funds, and if the intent is retention, my perspective would be, even though we do have needs in the fall for students to keep them enrolled in the fall, I am more concerned about the ability for those students to persist into the spring, because many students, they've already made their plans for the fall, they've already established that, and many times maybe they've exhausted all of the funds they have for the fall, and it's going to be the spring. So I don't know if that was considered in providing flexibility with the dates to allow some of those funds also to help retain students going into the spring. And then with the Texas grant and TEOG and other funds, again, appreciate the later date, but that date is also problematic with the beginning of the spring semester, when we've been given guidance to say this funds can be also utilized to help with spring Texas grant funds in my particular case. With the start of our semester, with our census date, with all of that, locking down kind of what is the student really able to receive, what are their tuition charges for the spring semester, that's not going to happen for my institution by February 1. Again, if that was later, it would give us the ability to really, come up with a plan to commit those dollars now, but to then have those dollars be reflective of the realities of the spring. Right now, the principal I'm making estimates of what student enrollment will be for the spring. We haven't even started registration yet. And so, deciding how much we should be giving to students, again, these dates, I think create not only we need to get this done quickly, but I think maybe not fully achieving some of the goals that these funds are intended to achieve, which is, again, keeping students going through these difficult times. So I don't know if there's any comment on that, and then do have another area that I'd like to point out, but I'll pause to see if there's any reaction to kind of what I've said or perspective that would help us.
And I think that there were 3 items in there, so let me just make sure that I caught them all. One was potential for any fluidity to the criteria, and hope that there's not going to be that same kind of changes as might have been seen in the CARES, the HERE funding. The second was the fall date, and really more just kind of the fall use of money versus using the money for spring retention. And then the third was the February date in terms of having the Texas grant, TEOG, TEG money. Did I get those 3? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
you've done a
cool.
great job summarizing those three kind of topics.
Well, let me address all three of those. First, in terms of the eligibility criteria, the FAQs that we've been issuing, we've been focusing on trying to make sure that we're providing information to assist you in the administration of the program, as opposed to changing anything about the contract that you've signed. So hopefully these FAQs haven't been causing you to have to rethink the pieces. I'm hoping they're just clarifying what's already in there. There hasn't been any discussion whatsoever since the contracts were established of changing the eligibility criteria for the educational emergency educational grants that are in the contracts. And then in terms of the Texas grant, TEOG and TEG, the only additional criteria, which is outlined in the contract, is that you follow the same Texas grant, TEG, TEOG awarding policy. It's just that they do need to be Title IV eligible. So from that, we're not looking to be making any kind of adjustments to that. And so we want to make sure that we've given you what you need so that you can effectively move forward with the funding. In terms of the question about fall versus spring, the focus in working with the governor's office and the funding that they provided was to do whatever we could to help with the current semester based on funds we had available to us at this time. I know that the agency is very focused on looking at what are other things that can be done to keep looking at how we may be able to support things moving forward. So this has the focus hasn't been kind of here's some money for the fall and that should solve all your problems. The focus has been here's some money for the fall. We're continuing to look at what can be done to help with the spring moving forwards. And so wanting to make sure that we get money out to institutions, out to students, to really address and help with this fall semester, and then continue to look at what are ways that we might be able to do other things for the future semesters. And then in terms of that February date, that February date had been picked based on the concept of when the majority of disbursements had occurred for the spring semester for the Texas Grant, TEG, and TEOG programs. But I've written that down as something for us to look at as to whether or not there can be flexibility in that date. Again, it's the same concept of trying to make sure that we have a date that provides institutions with enough flexibility to expend the funding, while also ensuring that if any funding isn't spent by institutions, that we're able to get that money back and reallocate it out to institutions who could spend it, since we very much want to ensure that we don't have any of these funds unspent. We're the pieces that we've talked about in this committee before about programs where we get money at the end of the year that's not spent and trying to figure out how to deal with those things. We are putting in some restrictions on this to very much ensure that this GEAR funding does not get returned to the governor unspent. I hope that helps address those three items.
No, I think it does, and appreciate, that, like you say, there are multiple priorities that are trying to be addressed, and I can see that in what's there. Just a follow up to what you said, and then another statement with regards to now I've lost my train of thought, but it will come back quickly. Let me go to the one and then come back to that. The mention of the next biennial appropriations of funds and the fact that we probably need to be preparing for probably reductions. No thought that we're going to see increases. And how that relates again to this infusion of money to Texas grant. What I am struggling with, I think other institutions, is how do we utilize these funds with anticipation of ability to renew at similar levels. And if we are establishing more initial year awards to students, because that's really where we have opportunity to make new awards, those are going to have to be renewed. And so again, just acknowledgement of that, and hopefully that is being carried forward as we're talking about funding Texas Grant, TEOG, TPEG funds. And again, I know that is difficult when there's only so much money to go around. The pie's only so big, but I think that is challenging, at least for me, to decide, okay, how do I utilize these funds and spend them in a timely manner in a way that they'll be able to be sustained. And again, that's just something that I think is a reality we're dealing with, and just a recognition of that. Probably nothing that can be changed. The other comment, again, talking about establishing these rules through the governor's office of these federal funds. I guess just, and again, this is a probably look into your crystal ball type thing, but with the HEROES Act and other legislative funding coming from the federal government, it appears the intent is to flow funds through the governor's offices again. And so should we anticipate, if there is additional infusion of funds through the federal government through the state, that the approach would be similar to what is here when it comes to especially this emergency grant funds? I mean, that again would be helpful for long-term thinking. Back to what Diane said, if we then get another set of rules that are different than CARES Act and our emergency funds, then this, it just becomes difficult to administrate and also confusing to students as to why am I eligible for this, not for this, and and as much as, again, appreciative of any funds we have and the ability to get them to the intended population, whatever thinking, if anything, that a similar approach exists, or would it be different? Is that something? Any thoughts about? Not even knowing if the federal government will come through with any more funds, and if they'll flow through the governor's office or through the states. Who knows what they may decide to do?
And this is John. Honestly, assume nothing.
Okay.
The HEROES Act passed back in May. Nothing's gone through the Senate yet. Senate Republicans and House Democrats are in very different places when it comes to additional stimulus legislation, as well as the White House. So I just don't think you can make any assumptions about whether additional stimulus is coming and what kind of format that might take. I mean, the sense is that there's probably going to be something passed, but these things tend to get decided at the last minute. So all I can tell you is I would not assume that the CARES Act laid down an unchangeable template for how this is going to be done in subsequent legislation.
Agreed. And I think what it is, again, if it were flowed through the governor's office and it was flowed through with the general principle of maximum flexibility of the governors to use those as best seen fit for the state, again, what would potentially that mean for how these funds would be distributed? And again, probably some of the same, don't assume anything, but maybe a bit more control, because I don't, again, not understanding the state legislative process versus the federal government. But again, maybe just something to think about to allow us, or again, and maybe the other part is if there are more funds, is there opportunity for kind of boots on the ground people, aid administrators and others to say, hey, here's really how you can effectively achieve what you want to achieve. And is it, a need-based criteria? Is it, again, those are all discussions not for today, but, I think getting input as to where do we see the needs to be, I think could inform decisions to provide the outcomes of success for the state that we're looking for.
And a piece that I would, two pieces that I would offer there is one, as you talk about the potential for the future, our ability as a group of institutions and the agency to work together and effectively expend all of this funding in an efficient manner and getting it into the hands of the students, I think will be a key point in demonstrating to the governor's office our ability to execute something of this magnitude, which I believe would help our case if we were looking to try to bring more funds to institutions. So that's a place where I think all institutions can really help with the potential future. We don't know what might be out there in the future, but if we can execute this program effectively and get these fall's funds spent and demonstrate that we can do this, that may help in making a case for further funds for the spring term or the future years. And another piece I did want to mention is that with the emergency educational grants, that our commissioner and chief of staff were very focused on making sure that we had institutional input on this. It was a very fast turnaround that had to occur, so it wasn't something that we could wait and bring to the Financial Aid Advisory Committee or put together a large committee of individuals, but we did for the emergency educational grant bring in representatives from both the public 4-year institutions and the public 2-year institutions to guide us on what they thought were key factors to put into the requirements. And so, should there be funding in the future, I feel very confident that the agency would take the same approach of seeking guidance from institutions to help ensure that the requirements that are assembled are effective.
Okay, I think we have 2 more questions. Brent, I think you raised your hand, but it went away. And then Denise, I think you also have your hand raised. So Brent, do you still have a question?
I don't have a question. This is Brent from Blinn College. As far as the February 1st date, tell me if I'm wrong, but the TEOG portion is just increasing our allocation and has to be reported separately, correct? So since it's the same criteria as TEOG, you could simply swap out your fall TEOGs with these funds and have them dispersed and done, and then that just increases your other allocation to use for a longer time period. That solves that problem.
Yes, you could definitely take that approach. When you report this information, you will report on FAD someone who received a TEOG, whether it was funded by state appropriation, whether it was funded by the GEAR funds. You'll report it just as a TEOG on the FAD. What we will do is next summer, we will provide a supplemental report, which our goal is to make it as simple as possible, but that will be an addendum to the FAD where you can provide the specifics of the individual students that you awarded GEAR funding to support their TEOG funds. And so we felt and in discussing with the institutions that we conferred with, we felt that trying to change the FAD and modify that, and have to reprogram your FAD to try to have an indication of which was the TEOG that was gear supported versus which was the TEOG that wasn't gear supported. We know that FAD changes are very difficult for implementation, and we've been doing our best to try to keep any of those changes to a minimum. And so our goal was to allow you to just report TEOG as TEOG on the FAD, and then there'll be a separate report to just have a couple elements to say, here are the people that we reported as TEOG on FAD that were supported by the Gear Fund program. And so that is absolutely an approach that you can take with that.
Denise?
Thank you, Robert. First of all, working with this, the new gear funding, I do have to send a shout out to Deshay because I blew her up yesterday with questions, and I appreciate her patience and answering every one of my questions. And so I do want to shout out to her and tell her thank you. If you could you explain the process that you guys went through in developing the particular amounts, the 2,500 and the 500 for the supplemental supplies, and also a thought as a community college, a small rural community college, gift aid. A lot of our gift aid is Pell, and I understand this is a last resort kind of emergency funds. But what's the rationale of leaving that Pell Grant as a part of that gift aid as well?
The concepts there in terms of the, I'll kind of take it, you talked about the 2,500, the 500 supplemental, and then the gift aid concept. The 2,500 was, the focus there was identifying an amount that was large enough to have an impact, but not so large that the program became one that only a few students were eligible or got funded. The idea of kind of spreading the funds out across the student population. But wanting to make it still, we didn't want the maximum to be so small that it wouldn't have an impact on a person's ability to stay enrolled. In terms of the amount of the supplemental expense, that amount was an amount we discussed with the institutions for feedback on that. We wanted to have an additional piece beyond just the tuition and fees to acknowledge the other expenses specifically related to coursework. And so that 500 was set based on guidance that they provided in those discussions. And then, as you mentioned, this is a last dollar scholarship. The concept of the program was very much focused on ensuring the coverage of the course expenses. And so in looking at that, it did focus on just covering that additional piece, and all gift aid was taken into consideration of that, since it was really, that's where its focus was on the tuition fees and supplemental expenses.
Thank you.
Heidi?
Chad, this might be a stupid question. The swapping out of TEOG would be the same and apply to Texas Grant as well?
Yes, everything I said about TEOG would be true for Texas Grant, would be true for TEG. We're one of the things Deshay and I talked a lot about in thinking through this is, she and I had both worked in financial aid offices before we came to the agency, and we tried to think about how might institutions approach this process just from the tracking standpoint, because it is federal funds. You do need to be able to track those federal funds. And so we were thinking about, we were wondering, like she and I talked, and I was like, well, if I was back at my last school and I had power fades, I'd probably set up a separate fund code, but I'd give it the same name. So it looked like Texas Grant to the institute, to the student, but I'd have the one coming out of the one fund and I'd have the other coming out of the other fund. And she was talking about, and you could do some swapping if you needed to. How institutions approach it, we didn't want to get into that nitty gritty with you in terms of saying it had to be done in a certain way. We wanted to keep it as broad as possible, that, it is federal funding, so you do have to be able to track it as an institution, because there are the requirements. There is one of the FAQs that points out, with federal funding, you have to track things for interest and things like that. And, we will need to know which items are federal funded. But if you want to do it as, a fall term swap out and just get all the money taken care of and spent, quite frankly, we'd be completely fine with that. The more that we can spend this fall and demonstrate that this money has gone out to the institutions, that the institutions have gotten it to the students, the better. But we also realize that some people may need to, based on the way their systems are structured, we purposely didn't do the date for the Texas Grant TEG and TEOG as a fall date that you had to spend it by, because we realized that institutions might need in their systems to do both a fall and a spring disbursement, right, in order to get it expended. So we wanted to provide the flexibility to do that. But yes, all those pieces, as long as you can track who you gave it to and how much of the students' Texas Grant or TEOG or TEG was supported by the federal funds, if you can provide that to us when we ask for that detail later in the year, then you're good.
Okay. Thank you.
Any more questions, comments? Okay. All right. Thank you, John.
Before we finish up on this external relations piece, one thing that I wanted to ask, so that John has the opportunity here as well, as the agency continues, to look at these things and think about the future. We know that, one of the big questions, this summer had been what things were going to actually look like in the fall. Was there going to be, there was guesses that we were making. We assumed that based on the economy, that there'd be an increase in financial need for students who are attending. There were also questions as to whether or not enrollments were going to hold steady or whether they might drop. Might enrollments drop such that any increase in need was offset by the enrollment drops, to really try to understand, what is the demand on the financial aid programs that we have. And so as financial aid administrators, you're in a great place to be able to give us some feedback as to what are you seeing on your campuses right now. Have enrollments dropped at a level that is offsetting any increased needs? Are enrollments, steady and need is going up? Do you have any feedback that would help us have some tidbits to really understand what's happening on your campuses by way of the demand on state appropriations for financial aid?
Well, Chad, I'll start. Here at San Jack, we have seen a decrease in enrollment. And I don't know if that's the same, across the state, but I know we have seen about a 5% decrease in headcount, about 7% decrease in contact hour.
And at San Jac, have you seen a significant increase in financial need through appeals and things like that? Or are you feeling that with the drop in the head count, your funding is still going to go as far as you need it to?
It's the FAFSAs are kind of flat at this point. We have not received any more. It increased a little bit during this the late spring and the summer because of the CARES funding. Students are applying for the funding, but it has since dropped or pretty much stayed steady.
Can anyone else provide us with some feedback so that we understand what's occurring? Rochelle, I think I saw your hand go up.
Yes. So here at SFA, we were pleasantly surprised. We've seen a dip in our enrollment, but not as great as we thought it would be. Now we're still in the drop period right now. I think we've got another day or so, but at this point, I'm going to say I'm shocked that it wasn't a little bit higher number. And talking about financial need and FAFSAs and special circumstances, we haven't really had that large of a request. We even made a push in the summer to students based on the CARES Act application we had to really contact those students that said that they had some loss of job, loss of income, that kind of thing. We actually reached out to those students. And we haven't really seen a big turnaround on those requests. We've had some, but it's not been that big of a difference yet. Now, with that said, I'm going to say come November or December, I think personally here we'll see a little bit more, of a higher increase in requests for those special circumstances, additional need, that kind of thing. But like I said, as far as enrollment, right now, today, we are pleasantly surprised it's not, a little bit larger percentage of drop in enrollment. So.
Thank you. I saw Lynn's hand go up and then Kelly's hand go up.
I was just going to say our enrollment, we're the same as SFA. We really, we were on track before all this happened to have a banner year for enrollment, which unfortunately we didn't get there, but we haven't dropped in enrollment. It has remained flat. In fact, I just asked Karen and she said there are about maybe 45 more than there were last fall. So, so it's pretty much flat as far as requests for a change to a student's need. It's been pretty stable as it has been in past semesters. So yeah, so I agree with Rochelle's synopsis.
Thank you, Lynn. Kelly?
Yeah, so we're very similar here at Amarillo College. We've seen a decrease in enrollment, but it wasn't what we anticipated at all. We were thinking we would see a drastic change, and it wasn't as negative as what we had thought. And we've seen a huge increase in requests for special circumstance reviews just based on loss of job or being temporarily laid off due to the pandemic. So we've done a huge amount of special circumstance reviews where we look and adjust their need. And so any additional funding we can get, we'll definitely spend it.
Does anyone have anything different compared? It sounds like, I mean, so far what I've heard is that the drops in enrollment have not been what you thought they would be. There has been some dip, but not what was thought. And I think a key piece that I've heard so far is, and it gets back to what Ed mentioned earlier in this conversation, is what is spring going to look like? You know, have people figured out how to make fall happen? But is there the potential for that, mid-fall semester appeal run of people trying to figure out how to make the spring work. Joy, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just want to add that Prairie View A&M, we've experienced something a little different. Actually, we've seen a slight increase in enrollment by about 300 students. A lot of that, I guess that's due to the ability of a lot of students being able to take classes online. So as a result of that, the need has, of course, gone down because with a lot of students not being on campus, they're not, needing that much additional funding as they've had in the past. So good for Prairie View. We've been able to increase our enrollment slightly due to some of the changes that we made on the academic side. So
it's always nice to hear a positive piece of this. Anything else that you all think would be important for us to walk away with to have an understanding of what's going on the college campuses as we think about how best to support you in the future? Well, Robert, thank you for letting me throw that question in at the end of the ER section.
Well, then let me just say that is very valuable feedback for me to have because we're in the base year right now. So it's this summer, fall, and spring of next year is going to determine funding for the subsequent 2 years for y'all. So it's important that we have that data. It's important that we have that perspective regarding what things are looking like now, as well as looking, forward. Can we see where the trend lines are? Can we see what we might expect in terms of enrollments even after the base year? That's very important for us to have.
Real quick, John, this is Claudette. Hi. Hey. I know I'm listening to the discussion and I had a question from the field that's somewhat related. Will there be a report out about these different, how their trends are right now? Do you know if there's anything in the agency that will be provided to show, any increases or decreases in enrollment? Because we've gotten this request from other stakeholders.
So typically, we would have our preliminary headcount information at the October board meeting. My understanding is that we're still on a track to be able to do that. So I would expect in October we would have preliminary fall headcount.
Great, thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is a joint update of the HB3 and online TASFA and the TASFA subcommittee. So first we have presenting Claudette Jenkins, Director of College Access.
Good morning. I'm going to try to be as quick as possible because I know you all have a break coming up, but I'm providing the update for the House Bill 3 requirement that states that, students are required to complete a FAFSA or TASFA as a graduation requirement. And as you know, this does not go into effect until the class of 2022. And so we're looking at, we're still in that development phase. So I've been working very closely with the Texas Education Agency to make sure that I can provide an accurate update from their committee, because as we talked about during the last call, or the last meeting actually, the Texas Education Agency has their own FAFSA advisory committee that's going to be making recommendations on, the opt-out process, resources, different things that they're tasked with. So what I'll be sharing with you is their update that I got from them. I also sit on that committee as a guest, but what they've done is that the FAFSA Aid Requirement Advisory Committee has convened in July and in August, and they'll continue to meet monthly throughout the fall. Some of the things that they've done so far are getting the work groups, providing feedback on TEA's proposed opt-out form, because there is an option for students to either opt out if they're 18 or older, or get a student parent signature. Or a counselor is supposed to be able to provide that opt-out form as well. So they had the work group first task was to think about what the opt-out form looks like, what it would do, the different language. Also at this point in time have provided feedback on the implementation resources. So part of this committee's task is to develop toolkits for various stakeholders like parents, students, and counselors. And so they've gone through a process of review for those resources. There's a lot of resources that are available already, and they were really looking at what would be most helpful for students. So that's what the FAFSA Advisory Committee at TEA has done currently. I also oversee the TASFA Advisory Committee that's with the with our agency. And so our committee met, they convened in 2 times already in July. They convened early at the beginning of July and the end of July. And some of the information I'm sharing is just some of the conversations that we had. So the first meeting was really to talk about the task and what their role as an advisory committee was. So we discussed topics like the procedure, development, and associated costs, because that's what the tasks are for this advisory committee. We looked at costs and considerations for the ETASFA. The committee also looked at the technical and functional revisions of what would be needed in the Applied Texas system. For those of you unfamiliar, the TASFA is expected to be housed within the Applied Texas application system. And this is a little different because the suite itself is a hub for the admissions process, but it does have several different suites to it. So it's got the application suite, it has an administrative suite, it's got a counselor suite, lots of different mechanisms already. So this would be an additional add-on to the Applied Texas application. It unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but it's interesting to think about the development, because right now this is all within this entire suite, but we're adding or integrating the separate application. So there's a lot of questions and complexities with thinking through the technical and functional revisions that would need to happen to add that to the Applied Texas system. During the meeting, we also had the advisory committee asked to have panel discussions to talk about, with existing institutions that had an existing ETASFA, because they wanted to learn what their processes were. They wanted to learn what they experienced. So we're able to do that, and I'll share some of that here with you shortly. The committee also wanted to hear from student users or have an understanding of the student experience. So we were able to put together 2 different panel discussions for the committee. During this time, we also were able to create 2 different subcommittees, one that was focusing more on the higher education side with the technical pieces and how data transmissions and all those different other technical pieces would be at the higher ed institution. And then they had a separate committee that would be student focused, really looking at that student experience, talking about how students can use they can use both the hard copy TASFA as well as the online TASFA. So that was a summary of what was happening at the 2 committees. I did share, I think you have some materials or a PowerPoint that I put together. I'll try to go through these quickly, but through the committee, we did discuss again some considerations on procedure, development, and those associated costs. So some considerations that the committee initially discussed were how the TASFA might be how to upload additional documents like tax transcripts, verification of selective service, different things that would be able to tie to the FAFSA that would be ideal for the implementation of this TASFA application electronically. They also talked about connecting the application to selective service within that online portal if it was developed, collecting electronic signatures from both the student and the parents, also having options to opt out of this physical signature. They talked about uniformity of all the supplemental documents that need to go to any institution. So if you remember the intent of this bill, House Bill 2140, and the development of this advisory committee was to really streamline this process for students. That's the ultimate outcome from what I've understand from stakeholders. Across the state, everyone uses different forms, they use different procedures, and so this was supposed to be intended to help streamline that process so students can apply using one application and possibly send it to multiple institutions, and it be more of a uniform process rather than different processes. So that was something, this wish list is really thinking about what would be ideal for the eTASFA. They also talked about tying core residency questions, ID pins, security was a big issue as well, and having procedures for students to think about the next steps in the process, similar to FAFSA, similar to some of the other advising that would happen using this form. So those were some of the things. Another thing was the alignment with the institution's technical capabilities. That was another thing, and that's why we have the higher ed subcommittee talking through what it looks like on the campus and how potentially, if there was an established eTASFA online that was a statewide application, if the institutions would have the capability to receive and work within those infrastructures to receive that data transmission.
Claudette, I see
yes.
that there's a question from Lynn Kenyon, so maybe we could take that question real quick.
Sure.
And this may be something you're about to talk about, but this is just for my for clarification, because for my own ignorance. Is the intent simply with this to have a common way for all students to complete the same form, and you're just going to collect the information, and then we have to load it into our system and calculate the federal methodology EFC, or will you be calculating, integrating the federal methodology into this process so that you're calculating the EFC just as the federal processor does with the FAFSA?
That's a good question, and that has come up. I did not put that in the notes, but that was a discussion point during the process. That's another thing about developing mechanisms on calculating the EFC. That's a big one and it really just depends on what, I will get to this later on versus homegrown versus an existing vendor. Because, with the homegrown system, if we were to start this from scratch with the state, all of those mechanisms would need to be developed. And so from the conversations that we've been having with the committee and the stakeholders, a lot of them want very similar structures that are tied similar to the FAFSA, and how the FAFSA data is transmitted, how that they receive all of these different similarities. So it's not changing the systems that they have in place. So that's what a bigger discussion that we've had, but it's a good, I'm glad you brought that point up. Right now, we're not sure what that recommendation would look like, if that's the structure, whether we send or a pass-through of information and you all do that calculation, or if it'll be calculated within a system. It really just depends on whether we move from a homegrown version and develop that, or a vendor version that may already have that in existence. So that's where we are. I hope that answers your question.
That does. I just wasn't aware of the full scope of what the intent is for this project. So thank you.
Sure. And really right now, the advisory committee is responsible for just researching the development, cost considerations, and those types of things to make recommendations to the legislature coming up January 1. So that's when it's due. The recommendations to the legislature are due January 1. However, we are on an expedited timeline. We met 2 times. The committee themselves wanted to meet more frequently. Of course, that's a complex issue with, school starting and the pandemic and everything like that. So we're doing our best to make sure that we're getting all the info gathering done as quickly as possible so that they could make some recommendations to the legislature about this development. And I'll go through some of these here and shortly as well. And the other things that were talked about was the timeline, for development when the committee makes the recommendations to the legislature, what that would look like, how long it would take for development. Again, there are lots of questions, whether it would be a homegrown version, a version, or a vendor version. Also considering testing, considering technical specifications, for software providers on an annual. thinking through procedures when the paper TASFA is updated so that there's an alignment, that there's an annual update on a regular basis if the paper and the online version were to be updated in the same time. So those were some of the things that they talked about. And of course, cost is a big issue. In the bill or in anything, there is no legislative funding to support this effort. So one of the key things that the committee has talked about is where the funding would come from. And there was already an initial thought that they would seek funding from the legislature. So that would be one of the recommendations. The other discussion point for costs was whether or not institutions would be supportive of providing some sort of funding, a cost share amongst institutions to have or maintain this this system or this application. And it really would, from my understanding, would come down to a return on investment for the institution. And so that's where we're trying to make sure that we're addressing all of the institution needs and whether this would be helpful for every institution to use. So there's a lot of moving pieces there for cost. We did have, like I mentioned, a higher education e-TASFA panel. So those were the existing, from what we understand, the existing representatives from institutions that have an existing e-TASFA already developed. They were at varying stages of development or implementation. So we had Texas A&M University, Texas A&M University, San Antonio. We also had UNT, University of North Texas. University of Houston was also on the list. Unfortunately, they were unable to make it at the time, but these are the institutions that we know exist in the state that have an existing e-TASFA or they're in some sort of development for one. And so we wanted to hear from them about their different challenges. Again, thinking about whether they built it on their own, the implications of building it on their own and using a vendor. We talked about their cost, file formats used, because again, from our committee, we've been learning that a lot of the stakeholders want to have that similar ICER format transmission. So that's the kind of setup that we would they would have to do or implement if we were collecting data in this application and sending it in a similar format so that it matches their systems. We also talked about data security. There's a lot of other questions we had, but these were the high points that we talked about. And because they were at varying stages of implementation, we got a good perspective of what they were what they could share with us. So I put together some key considerations that they discussed in thinking through if the state was doing a statewide application. And so some of those key considerations were how students would make corrections to a TASFA if it was online, having the Spanish versions of the product, possibly students needing to feel more secure about putting information into a system like an online system, and that the information that's collected through this would only be used for financial aid purposes. Also having an opportunity to create a dashboard to see where the students are in the process of the application process with the TASFA or the e-TASFA. And then finding or using the data that's collected to be more proactive in communicating with students to let them know where they are in the process. We also talked about them having the ability to reset applications. So it's a lot of these details that from their learning experience they shared. These are some things to think about in incorporating and during the development. And then also asking only relevant questions and using skip logic if they don't apply. So those were some suggestions from it. We'll have notes from the last meeting if you want more information and detail, because there was a lot of valuable information, especially since they were at varying stages of implementation. But these were summary of some of the recommendations they provided to the committee. And we would hope that we would be able to integrate when we get into some sort of development.
Claudette,
yes.
One thing before you move on, even though it wasn't listed on your higher education e-TASFA panel, I just wanted to mention that you also very much have UT Austin's homegrown piece represented, because they are part of this whole discussion process. So I just wanted to make sure everyone knew that that institution was also represented.
Thank you. And this is the unique position that we're in, because UT Austin is the vendor of the Applied Texas system, there was an initial thought that they have an existing eTESFA, as Chad mentioned. And so we were thinking we could model that, and they can shift the focus to making it a statewide application. However, that idea has changed substantially because of the capacity and different things. So we know that UT does have a homegrown version, and they did provide feedback as well. But their system currently, it's a static application on their website, and the data goes directly into their systems. And so it's a little different than changing it to, again, transfer to multiple institutions that would again, streamlining this process, but changing it to make it go to multiple institutions when it's not really set up to do that currently. So that's another discussion point that we've had. We have had the Applied Texas team at the table for thinking through what it might look like if it is a homegrown version within the Applied Texas application. What money would support that development, because it's not as easy as just switching the channel and making it go to different institutions. There's a lot of things that would have to be considered. So that's why we've gone back to whether there would be homegrown versions or vendor versions, to see, especially with the time frame that we have, because we have to have this established for the 22-23 application cycle. So that's where we're having a lot of discussion, and again, this timeline has to be expedited in some way for development if we are unable to use existing infrastructures that are in place. So through UT. The other thing that we had was a student panel discussion to assess the student experience. We had one of our committee members put together a small panel of students that actually use both the PDF version and the eTESFA. And so we asked them several different questions. The presentation slides, I provided some of the high-level discussions that we had. So they were asked about differences between the PDF version and the eTESFA application that was from one of the institutions that they applied to. So out of those institutions that were listed, it could have been UT, A&M, UNT, any of those institutions. So they were able to provide that experience to the committee. So the discussions between the PDF version and the eTESFA version, obviously the PDF version was broad but good and not as convenient, was something that the students did say. They said they preferred the online version because it was easier, but obviously depending on where they went, there were different systems. You know, again, you were thinking about the homegrown systems and the vendor versions. Those were different across those institutions that had an existing eTESFA, because they either had that vendor version or they had their homegrown version. And so there were different processes again for the student to share their experience. So just keeping that in mind. So the students also shared their experiences with the eTESFA. They did share specifics about, that there was no way to submit forms, again, that supplemental documentation. They didn't get the feedback loop on when for next steps, if never got an email for parent signatures. So this delayed the application process. Some of them said it delayed it for 3 months or more because there was no feedback loop in getting that information. They were also unsure on how to submit the signature, so they finally had to contact the school to figure out how to submit signatures, and the school informed them that they needed to print and fax the signatures over. Some students said that this was a lengthy process because of the submitting supplemental documentation. Again, the application was on hold for several months, and the school never contacted them for next steps. So that was something that was really learned. Another thing that was shared was as users, the English is a second language, so the questions were a little complicated. And so that was something that they would have liked to see a little bit more information on how, a little bit more, I guess, the language differences. So that was something that they shared with them. Some of the recommendations that came up with, we asked them several times, what would you recommend for improvement if we were to have a statewide version? They definitely wanted more communication from institutions on next on the next steps. They wanted clear language, boxes for signatures or a place for signatures, and not just making it a requirement after it was submitted. And that again ties to processes. They also discussed continuing to allow print signatures though, because similar to the FAFSA, you would have to, there's an opportunity for a parent to sign and submit. So they wanted that same capability as a student user. They also had ideas to provide modules or have some pre-recorded videos with instructions to kind of complete both the hard copy version and kind of walk through the online version as well if necessary. They also suggested including notes with additional information for each of the questions. And I thought this is very similar to the FAFSA, how FAFSA writes out, if they have a question about these things that they would like and appreciate notes to walk them through that process as well. They also wanted the ability to send their application to multiple schools, which is something that we're hoping to address with developing an online eTESFA. And then another suggestion was thinking about combining Applied Texas and eTESFA together. So I guess pre-populating information. This would be definitely a huge deal if we were able to do this, but again, making systems talk to one another is somewhat of a complexity as well. But I think it's manageable, and again, just depending on how the committee decides to move forward is definitely something that we can explore. Also having, again, back to communication, having access to financial aid counselors to assist the students, especially considering that they're first generation students. So these were their recommendations that we found very valuable in thinking through how the committee wants to proceed with a development of the eTESFA. So the next meeting is going to be held on September 9th, which is next week. Key topics for discussion at that meeting are going to include another panel discussion. Again, we're in that info gathering stage because this is a newly formed committee. So the committee wanted to hear from other states that had a statewide online financial aid application. Chad was gracious enough to send out to the listserv that he was on an association. He sent out to a listserv, and there were several states that responded back. So I've been having calls with them, brief calls to see if they fit within the infrastructure that the state is trying to build in developing an online application. There are some considerations whether they're a centralized or decentralized state and how they award funds. So we're learning from those different states right now, and I have invited a few states to come and talk to the committee next week, and I think they have some really good information to share about how they went about creating their own online application for state aid, and we can learn some things from them as well, especially since they're at a state level. We will continue discussions for the procedures and development and cost of the eTESFA, and then we'll have some subcommittee updates. Again, the higher ed side and the student focused subcommittees will present, and then we'll have proposed draft recommendations. So we're just going to come with an idea of what we might have as far as recommendations to the legislature and work from that as a starting point as we continue to meet with this committee. So that's all I have for you right now. I see that there is a question.
Yes, it's me. What is the idea behind linking to the selected service website? Is it to allow the student to register, or is the TESFA going to submit the registration for the student? And the reason why I'm asking is because undocumented students cannot register online without a social.
I can't speak to that. I don't know. That was just a suggestion that they wanted to include, and that's come up in various conversations. So I don't know if anyone else can provide some information. But that is something that they've asked for. I think it's again, from what I'm hearing, a lot of the institutions want something similar to FAFSA. And only because their systems are already set up that way. And I think that's where they, just want to include lots of different ways to catch the student. And that's pretty much what they've asked for.
Okay. Do we have any questions for Claudette? No? Okay. Sorry, Ben.
Hey, thank you, Robert. Just a couple of questions. You're talking about that student input. Was there a discussion when they were mentioning the video instruction, talking about having, actual, when there are certain documents requested, that there are visuals that provide, here's an example of this certain document, or also providing a virtual chat, so when they were filling out that form, there was someone virtual they could contact with as they go through it?
They did mention what you had mentioned earlier, as far as looking and seeing how to maneuver through certain pieces of the actual documentation. I really like that idea of a virtual chatting. Our agency is really moving towards that with our new ADV texting campaign that's happening, or an ADV tool in which we're trying to be more proactive in working with students, either through text. And if they don't have if the text components don't answer the question, it'll be escalated to a virtual advisor. And it's a human person that they could talk through. So we are moving in that direction, because obviously we know that there's more support now that students are not in school, and we don't know the future of these things, but we're finding that that's a valuable piece. But yes, they did bring that point up. But we are looking at several different ways in order to support students through this time, and even with other documents, but with this one specifically, because it takes time and attention. And especially another thing that came up, and I kind of alluded to this in here, but the sensitivity of this information that's provided in a document, either hard copy or online, was another thing that we needed to consider. And so when I talk to other states, they do put some sort of notification letting the student know and feel secure that when they put information in here, that in a system, that it is only for financial aid use. And so and for determination of aid. So that was something that, was in alignment with what we want to do with our with this application, should it be developed, hopefully. And, those are some things that they wanted to consider. Again, sensitivity of information, and not make students feel that they can't use these different forms or the online version. So that was something that, again, a resonating thing. We also, during the student feedback, we had them as an anonymous user, because we wanted to be very careful with those students that were providing the information, since they are students that qualify for financial aid, but we were able to have that feedback from them as well. So, yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And if you have any other questions, I'm available. You have my contact information on the slides that were provided. And if you have any questions specifically for the high school graduation requirement, I provided my colleague Alexis Bauserman's information, and she could provide some additional assistance to you as well.
Okay, thank you, Claudette.
You're welcome.
Okay. I'm going to give a brief update on the TASFA subcommittee. It's not going to take very long, and then we'll take a break. Basically, I provided a handout in the agenda. The bullets there are a little outdated, because I submitted this report before the FAFSA updates were released. So instead, I'm just going to cover the email that Shay sent on September 1st, which is announcing that the PDF TASFA was available. So the updates that were made to the TASFA were first introduced clarification on the application, similarly to the FAFSA, to specify that it is a free application. We also added the adjusted gross income, taxes paid, improved explanation on the parentheses on item 71 and item 74 to better align with the FAFSA verbiage. Added additional verbiage throughout the document to clarify the questions on the TASFA should be answered or marked as not applicable. Added verbiage about selected service as a resource for students who may be unfamiliar with the selected service requirement or the term exempt. Added verbiage to direct students to the financial aid office if they have questions about the selected service status. Like I said, this was an announcement to financial aid directors to let us know that the PDF test file is available, and the paper test file in both in English, I mean the PDF test file both in English and Spanish will be available to students on October 1st. Yep. Are there any questions, comments? Okay, so we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back at, Chad, will you say 10, well,
11 o'clock.
11 o'clock, yeah.
Let's plan on starting again at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
is we'll need to reestablish the quorum.
Okay.
Do you want to go ahead and get started, Robert?
Sure, we can go ahead and get started. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to I'm going to go down that roll again to reestablish quorum. Please announce yourself when I call your name. Starting with Tacy.
I'm here.
Okay. Ben.
Here.
Shannon.
Here.
Carla.
Here.
Paul.
Here.
Rochelle.
I'm here.
Heidi.
Here.
Lynn.
Here.
Tam.
Here.
Shona.
Here.
Thomas.
Here.
Samantha.
Here.
Kelly.
Here.
Christine.
Here.
Joy.
Here.
Foreman. Okay. Denise.
Here.
Brent.
Here.
Jace.
Here.
Diane.
Here.
Yeah. Ed. Okay, I see you, Ed. I don't know if you're back. And I see you're here. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
I'm here.
Okay. Okay. And then Chad and myself, of course. Okay. We're all back. I was for Foreman. Okay, so next item on the agenda is Lynn giving us an update on the TASFA recommendations.
Okay, as you can see by what I submitted to be included in the handouts, I just have several things that TASFA has been working on, and I just thought I'd go over those really quickly. We only had one recommendation at the very bottom, but first of all, as all the TASFA members are well aware of, we had to, because of the COVID-19 issues, we had to cancel several, well, all of our typical in-person workshops and conferences and training sessions over this year. It's been a very strange year, as it has been for a lot of people. We are trying to get together some online training opportunity for new aid officers, since we weren't able to do new aid officers workshop or ABCs. That committee is trying to put together something that can be available to new aid officers in an online version. And we are also trying to get together an online opportunity for the NAST for credentialing training that we were going to do in professional judgment at our spring regional training workshops. We're trying to get that together to present in an online version. And hopefully that will happen later this month or sometime in October. More information will be sent out as soon as we have the details confirmed. We've also already made the decision that our new aid officers workshop for next spring will be online. It will not be in person, because we anticipate still having many restrictions with the continued social distancing because of the virus. Our elections have, when I put this presentation together, we had not yet completed the elections process. Elections have been, our voting has taken place now, and the Nominations and Elections Committee is currently just confirming one more time with those that receive the highest number of votes their willingness to continue to serve. And as soon as they do, we receive that information back, I will be sending out an announcement for the results of the election. I do want to apologize because for when I put this together, I didn't include Keith Holscher on there for some reason from Angela State University, who is a candidate, and he is not on that list. So I apologize to Keith for not including him here. He was included on the ballot, so his name has been out there for voting purposes, but I do apologize to Keith. Recent board activity, at the beginning of the year, I created several task forces that have been doing some work during this past year, and at the last board meeting, we did adopt several items based on those task force reports. We adopted a disaster recovery plan, an updated corporate sponsorship plan, and a statement concerning diversity and inclusiveness, which was very timely, I might say. So I'm very proud of the work that those task force did and the accomplishments that we have made toward those items. We also did a review of the membership dues and structure and determined that no changes were needed at this time, and also made the decision that because of possible budget restrictions for this upcoming year, that institutions who are experiencing financial struggles due to those cuts can contact our membership committee, if they're not able to actually pay the membership dues, and we will take those concerns into consideration to see what we can do to assist those institutions. Also, when I put this together, we had not solicited yet for TASFA awards, and I did send something out about a week ago that we are now collecting nominations for the various TASFA awards. So if any of you as members of TASFA have some deserving TASFA members that you would like to nominate for the various awards, now is the time to do that, and that nominations process will be open through the 14th. We will, as required by our Constitution and bylaws, have our annual business meeting on October the 9th. It is currently being planned for that morning from 9 to 11, where we will take care of some annual TASFA business. We will have our awards ceremony, and to kick off that business meeting, prior to the business meeting actually starting, we're going to have a federal update from the Department of Education and a state update from CHAD with the coordinating board, not only because we're not able to do that at a fall conference this year, we thought this would be a good opportunity to provide that to our membership, but also because we thought it might be a good draw for our membership, because we have to have a certain number to meet a quorum for that business meeting. So put that on your calendars, because I think it will be a very good couple of hours for our membership to participate in. And then the very last thing on here was the recommendation to the coordinating board. I've received a couple of requests from members to see if TASFA could encourage putting the TASFA application on a faster track, if at all possible, because many of the institutions, because those TASFA applications have grown so much, and it is such a manual process right now, that looking into possible vendors has proven to be a very expensive option. And so we're very much looking forward to any electronic assistance with the TASFA applications. So it was just a request to put it on as fast of a track as possible, but I have a feeling you're already doing that. So, but that's our only recommendation at this point. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Okay.
I'll be sure to pass along that recommendation to Claudette.
Okay, thank you.
Robert, you're on mute.
Sorry. Next on the agenda, we have the school district recommendations with Ben and Shauna.
Hey, Shauna, did you have anything if you want to go first?
Oh, sorry. Dr. Shauna Norton, still learning the difference between my video camera and my microphone. So the one thing I want to say is March was a long time ago. So if any of this is a repeat, I apologize. But I did collect some data from some of the local school districts here in North Texas just about the new FAFSA requirement. And a lot of it is still questions. I think when they said that they were going to release things by the fall of 2020, I think everybody was expecting that to have happened by now, even though we know how the processes work. So I know one of the questions that was asked previously a while back, and I don't know if a decision's been made or if it was something that was dropped, was perhaps about removing the priority deadline back now that FAFSA was a requirement. And if the priority deadline was moved back, how would districts consider, I mean, are they going to consider that with their deadlines for FAFSA graduation requirements and such? So locally, there was a lot of support for moving the priority deadline because a lot of the campuses around here would like to use the priority deadline as kind of their, this is when you need to have it completed by. If you haven't completed it, then this is what's going to happen and this is what we're going to do. And they're hoping to limit the number of students that they would have to complete an opt-out form for. It was kind of evenly split as to when they wanted to move that to, if that was still a possibility and if that wasn't something you were open to, which was between March 15th, between March 15th and April 15th, kind of anywhere in between there, somewhat of an even split. Biggest concern with school districts around here is not getting students to complete the FAFSA, but how are we going to make parents complete the FAFSA? And again, because we're just not sure how that's going to count into our accountability. You know, if a student completes it, but we can't submit it because the parent didn't complete it, we're assuming as a non-completion for us. And again, if we get too many opt-out forms, we aren't sure about accountability. And I think that about covers what most of the questions and concerns were kind of lying around that. The thing with the FAFSA priority deadline is that if that is what schools kind of have set, it's easier to connect our graduation deadline with that. And then obviously, if it's connected to accountability, most schools would still allow people to continue, but I think that's when we would start the you didn't complete this, so you're going to have to do the opt-out form instead portion.
All right, just for me, along the same lines, a lot of the things that Shauna covered. One thing that we've been looking at is, I heard the conversations earlier about enrollment numbers, and with our current situation too, it's been interesting in our district where our enrollment is so far down about 4,000 students, very significant for us. And so just talking to other colleagues, it's a battle that they've been facing too with this online environment, and some still being unsure as some haven't even started school yet until next week around us. So that is a concern, but then also we've started and just trying to get students online through the process to attend classes is a challenge. We use a learning management system in the district, and we feel the teachers and the students have become more familiar with that. And so going back to earlier, our conversation about the creation of the online portion to help with the e-TASFA, we've been considering creating, just a financial aid application course in our learning management system. So if a counselor was to release that out to students that would be a format that would be understandable by the students at this point, because that's how they're working through their learning modules. So creating something that's compatible with that, and then along the same thought, creating whether it's video that goes along with that with explanations to hopefully increase the numbers, and making something that's easily accessible and maybe maneuverable through for parents and for students. So, but at the forefront for sure is just really capturing the amount of students back into the district and getting them back in a foothold of what this learning module looks like. And then on top of that, I think Shauna did a good summary of some of the other concerns too for accountability.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments for Shauna and Ben? Okay, thank you both. The next item on the agenda is the Data Collection Subcommittee. Samantha?
Hi, everyone. The Data Collection Subcommittee did have an in-person meeting scheduled in the spring. Since it was after spring break, that when all the institutions went to remote working, that meeting was postponed until May. We rescheduled it as a virtual meeting. At that time, the group all made a decision that we're not going to meet as well, with everything still going on at our campuses, and at that time the needs of the coordinating board for our assistance. But we did want to make the group available for any questions or issues that Deshay's team may have had for us. And so over the summer, there were 2 issues that we handled through email and through comments back. So there was an initiative to improve the Student Financial Aid Program's web pages. And so we were sent information on what those updates were, and were given an opportunity to provide any feedback on the information. And this is all included in the handout. Then there was a second communication from the Financial Aid Services Communication Group about the current system authorization form, changing it to a user access form. Again, the committee had an opportunity to look at those forms and provide any feedback that we had from a school perspective. So that was the most recent activity that we had. We have discussed and do plan to have a virtual meeting, since we haven't met in a while, in late October, early November, to discuss whatever needs we have at the time. I'm sure FADs will be discussed, potentially this additional reporting through the GEAR programs. Again, whatever the needs are for a school perspective to Deshay's team at that time. In addition, I will, as everyone heard from the beginning, be rotating off of the council meeting. So at the next meeting, it sounds like there will be an action item to elect a new chair for the data subcommittee. So I encourage, it's been a wonderful experience. It's a great team to work with. I've even asked if I could continue just as a member. So I would encourage all of you to consider leading up this group in the future, as well as the new members that are coming on. It's been a good learning experience, and it's good insight. So any questions about the data subcommittee?
Okay, no questions, Samantha. I just want to thank you for your support in this subcommittee. I know you have been great help for that subcommittee. And yes, we are going to postpone the election of the chair for the subcommittee until the December 10 Financial Aid Advisory Committee meeting. Okay.
Robert?
Sir?
Before we go on to agenda item number 12, I wanted to circle back to the school district recommendation piece because I realized I should have asked a question about the priority deadline feedback that they provided. And basically the question is to the Financial Aid Advisory Committee as to whether we should be having, whether the committee feels we should be having more detailed conversations about the potential to move the priority deadline. I know we've been providing some feedback to you all about different data and things like that, but whether, based on the data, based on the feedback from the high schools, whatever knowledge you have about your particular situations, do you think that this is an item that we should be more actively discussing to make a decision on?
Yes, I think this is something that, hearing their concerns, they need to have something to encourage students to complete the application so that they have the numbers to graduate. So they can meet their graduation requirements. And the earlier they can get it done, I guess I'm assuming the better for them. For community college, the deadline really doesn't make a difference, but I'm sure it will makes a difference for four-year schools. So if we can get your perspective, please let us know.
From the four-year institutions that are part of this, because you are the group that has the deadline, are you all open to discussion? Would you encourage discussion? Do you think that we should just not be touching this? We need to have some feedback to know what direction we should be going. Shannon.
Hi, Chad. Shannon Crossland, Texas Tech University, and we've had this discussion as well. And we are at Texas Tech. We are providing award notification so much earlier in an attempt to, get our students the best offer on the table, and so that would help us out tremendously. We're sending out award letters as early as December the 1st. For our students for the next year. So the priority date kind of puts us in a bind there, not being able to reach those students.
Any other thoughts that you feel the agency should consider?
Great, Chad, this is Diane. I guess the thing I would like to say is that I think you're in an interesting position at this point because you've gotten a lot of feedback from the higher ed community that we would like to see it earlier or go away, just because it does cause some issues for us relative to changing award dates and other things. And now you've got the state mandate of students filing the FAFSA at a certain point in time for high school graduation. And so this throws things into a whole different loop for that population, as we've just heard. So I don't know in my mind how to reconcile this for everyone. So I think that you have a challenge that I appreciate, and I don't have any great suggestions. How I understand the legislative intent because they want to give students the most access to federal and state monies as possible, as that is a base for students coming into higher education. But how you now deal with the constraints, or the tensions on both sides, I don't know.
I appreciate your honesty with the challenge that we're faced. So for those of you at four-year institutions, please know that I will likely be in touch. And Rochelle just turned her camera on, so maybe she has some additional feedback to provide.
It wasn't anything different than what Diane said. I mean, my concern is always how we're going to market it. We're changing a date again. It causes confusion with students and parents. And I mean, if we can't get rid of it, which is what our preference is to do away with it completely. And I understand from a high school perspective that is needed. I get concerned changing dates again. We're already looking at developing our marketing products for 2 years out. We're looking at them. They're not done, but I mean, we're definitely looking at them. It's just, I get concerned with that, and good luck is what I was going to show you.
Well, thank you. So, well, and I think, Shauna just raised her hand.
So I was just curious if we do away with the priority deadline completely, from our students' perspective, does that mean for the most part that they're going to have to look at each individual campus that they're interested in potentially attending to find out what their deadline is, more so than having that kind of standard deadline that the majority of people follow?
I believe we could run into that. One of the challenges we run into already is that the deadline only applies to the four-year publics and health related institutions. I think the Lamars as well. And so community colleges may have a different deadline. Private institutions may have a different deadline. And some, even within the institutions to which the priority deadline applies, some of those institutions have earlier deadlines than what's set. So the priority deadline already isn't a consistent deadline across the entire population of institutions. That if there were a way to achieve it, that would be the ideal, that everyone just had the same deadline so students didn't have to look to different places. But so far the priority deadline doesn't achieve that because it only applies to a limited number of institutions, and those institutions can have earlier deadlines if they choose. So.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to kind of clarify what that looked like. So.
Adding to the challenge. So, well, I will definitely be in touch with those of you on the four-year institution side to get some additional feedback, as well as those of you from the school districts to help try to think through this, to try to put forward something that might possibly address this. Thank you.
Okay, so next item on the agenda is legislative recommendations subcommittee. Shannon Crossland.
Good morning, everyone. This is Shannon Crossland. Our report is fairly lengthy. As with the other committees, we did not meet in person. We did all of our communication via email because of the remote environments that all of us were in. So we wanted to be sure we encompassed all of our discussions so that the advisory committee could have a good picture of the depth that we went to with our discussions. We wanted to ensure that we included, our recommendations took into consideration populations not being served. For example, our adult learners, our first generation students, our at-risk students, and meeting that gap. We started out with, I'm just going to highlight some areas from the report. It's rather lengthy, but on the federal and state alignment opportunities, we wanted to ensure alignment for our recommendations based on the 60 by 30 plan, while incorporating the principles of the state of financial aid as well. And we tried to include all of those in each of our opportunities that were presented before us. One of the highlights from the federal state alignment opportunities, we were charged with comparing the federal annual student loan acknowledgement and the state, the student debt letter. On page 2 of the report, we broke it down into different categories and we compared the state and the federal. Most of the lot of differences, as you can see, and then with the federal not actually starting until 2021. We've received that notice. Information dissemination, the state, it's for currently enrolled students, and that the institution must have at least one student receiving state financial aid. I know at our institution, we probably sent out about 17,000 letters this past year. For the federal, it's applicable to both student and Parent Plus borrowers. The different loans to include, of course, the federal only includes the federal loans, and the state with the including federal and state with the alternative loans being optional. We feel that that's a bigger picture and gives the student a true picture of what they are actually borrowing. There is no student parent acknowledgement with the state debt letter, but there will be with the federal. They have to acknowledge that they have seen this. They're routed through NSLDS and they have to do an acknowledgement. The consumer information piece, we do, they're very similar, estimated interest rates, estimated payments. So they're both very similar, but both very different. And currently, until we actually have students go out and do that acknowledgement, we don't know what kind of extra step that's going to cause for our students, whereas at the state level, as an institution, we just send that out using a template. Another thing I want to highlight as far as the alignment opportunities, we feel that they would remove some barriers for students if we mirrored federal programs and aligned with the selective service requirements, controlled substance requirements, SAP, and then with the Texas Educational Opportunity Grant. I know that a lot of our community colleges on our committee spoke to the matching requirement and how it is an administrative burden due to the timing, and that it has the ability to pile on funds to students who may already have sufficient funds, whereas they could use that for other students who need. And Robert, you can provide some more insight on the TEOG. I don't have a lot of experience from the student side, how that would impact students or someone from the committee to give the committee a better explanation of that. Let's see.
Yes, Shannon, in simple terms, basically what it does is we could use that money that we're using to match TEOG. We could give that money to other students. So we could just spread the money to more students.
Thank you, Robert. Another area that we looked at was work as a resource. And we looked back at the minutes from prior meetings, and based on information provided by the data collection subcommittee, that they've made significant improvements in this area. So we wanted to thank them for that. And then again, the discussion about the priority financial aid deadline. Back from our, I believe it was our November meeting, we had some questions from the Financial Aid Advisory Committee that we took back and discussed and brought forward. And some things that we looked at, one of the questions was about the data. We would like to we wanted to dig in more, but Chad has provided that on the charts that referenced in the beginning of the meeting, and those seem to be suffice for our discussion, looking at cycles across various sectors, and that we could see, when students were applying, and then Chad mentioning about the EFC, the higher EFCs applying later. So that was very helpful. We were also asked the committee asked us to understand the impact of setting a deadline and if there was any consideration to align the state and federal dates. As we talked about earlier, we could provide more robust award notifications to assist our institutions with strategic enrollment, especially at the 4-year. And we would just suggest eliminating that deadline date as an option, and because it does not seem to be in the best interest of our students. I think, as Rochelle referred to, it causes a lot of confusion when you're trying to market one date and then another date. It really confuses our students, and they want to get the best award package that they can. Another area we looked at was increasing the Texas grant from the $5,000. We wanted to look at this to an amount equitable of the average tuition and fees across all our institutions. An update from our, since we last talked in May, based on everything that has been going on with the budget cuts and not knowing what's going to be happening in the next few years, we would like to, if we're not provided additional appropriations to fund an increased target award, we would recommend that the target award remain at the $5,000 so that we can still service our students. We know that may not be possible based on the reductions coming down the pipe, but that's our recommendation. Some other items that we discussed that we didn't move forward were the CAL program, and that was clarified in our last meeting that about the year-end closeout, that's not the coordinating board, that is the comptroller. With the system outages and stuff, that's in the hands of the comptrollers. And then course program of study, really didn't touch on that. A lot of schools kind of do their own thing depending on their software. That makes it a little difficult. And then we want to follow the direction of the new leadership at the coordinating board and align everything with them. With the data collection subcommittee, providing information that a proposal was being discussed to redesign the net price calculator tool. We just tabled that one as well. And then promise programs and work study allocations. We felt that we addressed those, and they weren't, we didn't need to go into further discussion with them. We did, with populations not being served, as I mentioned earlier, we did think about all of that when we were looking at our recommendations. Our first gen at-risk students are adult learners. And then the Grad Texas, and just we would like to encourage more partners into this program for our state and private institutions. I would like to thank the committee. You have been valuable. I have learned a lot from you, especially from the 2-year perspective. Your input was valuable to help put this report together, so I appreciate all of you so very much. And any guidance or feedback that you have, I would be happy to entertain questions or research further and provide information for the committee.
Robert, I thought maybe it might be useful if I touched on a couple items that Shannon brought up, just so that everybody's aware of work that's occurring at the agency on some of these topics. So one of the pieces, before I talk about some things that we're already working on, circling back to that priority deadline piece, it sounds like, and I like to try to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting things when I have discussions with others in the agency, but it sounds like a key piece about the priority deadline is that students really need to be applying as early as possible and not waiting for the deadline and viewing the deadline as that's the date when I should apply. That they really need to be applying as early as possible in order to have the best advantage in terms of funding. And then conversely, that the deadline can get, it's kind of not only interpreted as I can wait until that date to apply when they really should be applying earlier if they can, but also that it gets interpreted by some students as the deadline has passed, so what's the point in even applying when they really should still apply, even if the deadline has already passed, because there may be things that they're still eligible for. And I wanted to check with all of you as to whether you think that that is an accurate representation of one of the challenges that we're facing with this deadline. Shannon?
Yes, Chad, I see that on our campus. If they don't apply as early as possible and know that the deadline has passed, they, just like you said, what's the point? They think that they don't have a shot. So getting them, and that's where our marketing comes in, getting them to apply as early as possible. That is a true representation.
Shauna?
Obviously, I'm not at a four-year university, but speaking from working with these students as seniors who are applying, I mean, that your statement is 100% true, is that, they look at deadlines as oh, that's the last time I have to do it, and trying to get them to fill things out earlier than that is difficult. And I think the schools looking at the priority deadline and the FAFSA graduation requirement is just the fear that students are going to be like, well, you said I had until the end of the year to complete FAFSA for graduation purposes, but now I don't get any money because I didn't apply early enough for my school to give me money. And so it's that balance of trying to figure out how to best lead these seniors who definitely don't have any clue what they're doing yet as they're entering the post-secondary world.
Is there anyone that wants to express that I didn't capture the concept correctly, to make sure that I don't move forward with this idea in an incorrect way? Okay, well then I'm gonna think that I got that. Another piece that I wanted to mention, I see in some of the other items that the subcommittee discussed about, while we've moved the roadblock to having a hold on academic transcripts due to a delinquent loan, that institutions have expressed an interest in still getting a report about their students that have a delinquent loan for their own loan counseling efforts and the like. And I wanted to let you know that that is a project that we're currently working on. I don't have a specific deadline as to when we're going to have that launched, but that is something we're reviewing right now as to how to make that informational piece available to institutions. Another piece I wanted to mention was about the net price calculator. And right now, the current model that we're investigating is to actually develop something that would be basically a wraparound of the federal Department of Education's net price calculator, so that we would always ensure that we were exactly in line with the federal requirements. It would be a standard that is known nationally, and that would provide institutions with everyone would have the exact same information about how to utilize that. So that's what we're looking at right now, is looking at how we might be able to build a wraparound to use the Department of Ed's net price calculator as the standard functionality to meet the state statute that requires that we provide the calculator function. So more on that as more investigation into that piece is done.
I'm sorry,
yeah.
can I ask a question? This is Diane.
Sure. Yeah.
This just it happened to come up with our UT Senate Council staff. Students met with myself and the head of the One Stop just recently.
Yep.
They are really pushing for a better tool. And yep. I let them know that, this currently was the tool that the state required. And, we were as well interested. I apologize, but I'm not particularly versed in the federal tool. Mm-hmm. So what they're concerned about is right now, when the student fills out the tool as it stands, it basically says your eligibility will be somewhere between 0 and the cost of attendance. There's no delineation in that. Does the federal tool allow for students to understand the difference between grants and loans? And, so if the school were to put their information in, would it give something back that was more relevant?
Sure. And I'll admit that we aren't far enough along in the whole investigation of this for me to answer that question in detail as to how the two systems compare. But that's absolutely something that I can look into to kind of understand what's being provided out of our current tool versus what would be provided out of the tool we're looking at, as well as a better understanding of how that ties to the information that institutions input into the tool. Because again, still looking at this in detail, but want to check to see, can the information that's provided end up being influenced by the type of information that the institution provides. So yes, we will look into that and see what we can do to provide you with some more detail.
That'd be fantastic. So 2 different things that I want to state is, one, if the federal tool at least gives the student a perspective of Pell and the loan, that would be super helpful. And then secondly, if the state is going to use it, if the student would have some indication of Texas grant or TEOG or whatever would be applicable to that institution, that would be incredibly helpful. And then the second piece was just to let you know that these students are very interested in being very vocal with the state legislature about this. So that'll probably be, it's coming.
Okay. Well, and as I said, and I think you did mention that, but this is something that, is on our project list that we're focused on trying to figure out how to move forward in the near future. So Heidi, I see your hand.
Yeah, hi Chad. I have a similar question or thought. So we were also analyzing the difference between the state one and other ones. So are you looking at implementing it for the next year? So that before we purchase anything, we would be able to see what you have, because I really don't want to use 2 tools unless I have to.
Just so I know, when you say next year, which year are you talking about?
So we have this year's submission. So would you be looking at being able to implement a new product by next year's?
So for the
21, 20, no, I'm going to be off when I say this.
For the 22, 23.
22, 23, right?
Okay.
Did I do that right? A year from now is 20. Yes, 22, 23. No, 21, 22. We're putting in the numbers now for 21, 20. Yes, 22, 23.
So I don't have the specifics on a timeline, since they're still working on trying to figure out exactly how that wraparound piece would work. But that's a piece of feedback that I will provide in the group that's looking at this. Is that piece of how it'll impact institutions as they look at the potential of, do they need a second product in addition to our current product or our future product. So I know, just from knowing what's out there, I know that there are net price calculators through private vendors that do provide a much more robust interface and details and things like that. The federal product is a free service. And since we don't have a funding source that would allow us to contract a private product for the entire state. Really, our two options are either trying to build something in-house or look at the Department of Ed product that's available as a free source. And so that's what we're currently looking at.
Thank you.
Chad, this is Ed. When you talk about the federal product, you're talking about the net price calculator, not the iPad data that determines net price for students that's out in the college
Right,
navigator.
the Department of Education net price calculator.
Okay.
Yes.
I think it would be interesting to determine how many Texas schools utilize the government net price calculator as maybe an alternative to what we have to provide to the state. My assumption is most people do not use it because they find it equally uninformative. So I mean, I guess the alternative, instead of having to submit the data to the state, we would submit it in the format of the federal government. May not be all that bad, but if it's trying to achieve something better, I'm not sure it's doing that. But I mean, that's my perspective. And I'm still of the belief with the FAD data that you have, you could use that data to extrapolate net price for, for our schools, based on income ranges or EFC ranges or whatever it is. I mean, the data is there. It may just be, I mean, again, it's may be considered older if it's final data, but it's still within the 2-year bound that the federal government says that it needs to be. But I still think you've got all the information for you to calculate based on FAD data, what is the net price that a student is paying with these characteristics that already are all a part of the financial aid database.
Okay. One final piece that was mentioned in the other items of discussion was the grad techs, encouraging more students to complete degrees and things like that. And that's a piece that I wanted to let you all know that the agency is very much looking at that population of returning students, especially students that have accumulated credits and are within 12 months of being able to finish up a degree or certificate or something like that. But there is a very renewed focus on that population of individuals who have completed some college education but haven't completed a degree or certificate. And it's still in the works. The renewed focus on it is just within the past few months that it's really started to move forward. But wanted to let you all know that that is a place that the agency is focused and that more information will likely be coming on that. Thank you, Robert.
Okay, thank you, Chad. Well, you have the next 3 items. Item 13 is the slate of nominees, 14 student representative from 2-year sector, and 15 Office of Student Financial Aid Progress.
Okay. Well, first I will talk about the slate of nominees. 1 second, I just need to find my notes versus your notes. One of the things that I like to remind everyone every year is that the process by which we develop the proposed slate for the board to consider, excuse me, when we get the nominations from institutions, what we're doing is trying to make sure that we are developing a slate that helps ensure that we've got coverage across all different types of factors. So we look at the university systems to try to make sure that we've got representation across all of the university systems. We look at geographic regions to try to make sure that all the different regions are represented. We look at things like the size of the institution so that we get the different perspectives of how a large versus a medium versus a small institution would work. And so we do try to make sure we take all of those pieces into consideration. This year, as in prior years, we did receive more nominations than we had slots available. And so the proposal that is being forwarded to the October board meeting for consideration is for Taryn Anderson has been recommended for a one-year term as the TASFA representative. And then the following individuals have been recommended for a 3-year term that would start with this December's FAC meeting. And that is Johanna Boley from Lone Star College, Victoria Chen from Texas Christian University, Didi Gonzalez from Texas State University, Bridget Ingram from Texas A&M University, Holly Nolan from the University of Houston, Clear Lake, Shauna Norton from Wichita Falls ISD, Stephen Peterson from Blinn College, and Arnold Trejo from University of Texas at San Antonio. So we will, the final review of that will occur at the October board meeting. Any questions about the slate before I move on? Okay, not hearing any questions. The next item that we'll be talking about that I wanted to bring to your attention for discussion relates to the student representative from the 2-year sector. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is that we have not received nominations for a student from the 2-year sector in any of the past 3 nomination cycles. And I wanted to check with the Financial Aid Advisory Committee as to whether you wanted to continue holding one of the committee slots for a student from the 2-year sector. One piece that I wanted to acknowledge is that with our requirement for that we've set as a Financial Aid Advisory Committee to hold a slot for someone from a 2-year institution, it does mean that that slot isn't available to a member of the financial aid profession. So from a particular institution. So that does, because there's a limit of 24 on the number of people that can be on the committee, it does limit the number that we can have. There are also several factors that make it challenging to identify a student from the 2-year sector. One is that the education code requires that student representatives serve a term of not less than 2 years. So it's not an option for us to offer a shortened term for students from the 2-year sector. It is also required that student representatives must maintain enrollment at a public institution for the duration of their term. And the nomination process itself occurs over the course of a whole academic year, followed by the 2 academic years serving on the committee. So in September 1 is the deadline for presidents and chancellors to begin soliciting nominations. They submit that to us by December 1st, and then the board appoints student representatives by February 1st to begin an appointment on June 1st. So, there's already a whole year of getting the nomination before the 2-year nomination process occurs. So there are a number of challenges just in how student representative nominations and terms are structured, to having a representative from the two-year institutions. Not saying we shouldn't have it, I just want to acknowledge to you kind of these roadblocks that can be in place, as well as the fact that we aren't getting nominations from two-year institutions, to verify that you want to continue holding a slot for a student, or whether you would prefer that that slot be available for another member of the community. Lynn, I see you have your hand up.
Well, just a thought, because of those challenges, what about getting the other student representative maybe from a four-year institution who has transferred to that four-year institution from a two-year school, so that they have that perspective?
So as part of the nomination selection process, if there is a nominee who has transferred from a two-year, kind of giving that person a bit of a extra weight, if there is someone in the pool, is that what you're saying?
Just a thought. I mean, okay. But otherwise, I agree that it probably shouldn't continue to be held, that another financial aid person be allowed to fill that spot, if possible, if we don't do something like I suggested. But it's just a thought.
What are your other thoughts? What are other people's thoughts on this?
Christine?
With the requirements that we've set in place for this, I don't think we'll ever find a student to meet the requirement. So I would vote that we get another member of the financial aid community to help.
Thomas, I saw your hand up.
Yes, indeed it is. I agree with Lynn's concept. If we can find somebody who has had that experience at the two-year school, that's very pleasant. I went back and I looked and I see that this is from a statute that has the requirement that it be no more than a two-year or no less than a two-year experience. I'm curious, more long-term, do we have any opportunity to get a tweak to the statute approved to drop that down to a 1 year for a 2 year student representative, in which case we'd be selecting a new one each year. But I think that we would have an opportunity to get some pretty strong engagement from people who have already had 1 year experience at a 2 year school and are looking to finish up their time that they're going to be at the 2 year school at the time that they're also helping us with the committee and having the discussions. I welcome having that student base at the table. Mm-hmm. I do see that it's certainly going to be a challenge relative to maintaining the expectations that are out there in the statute. And I haven't dealt with changing a Texas statute yet, so I thought I'd pose the question just to see. Changing one sentence is astronomically hard or just somewhat hard?
Well, and that's something I can definitely recommend to our external relations area and kind of give them this example of the challenge that we're facing, if we change to allow the slot to be available to a member of the financial aid community as opposed to holding it for the 2 year student sector, it's always something that if we are successful in the future of getting the statute changed, we could look at that time. I know that I think all of you would agree that statute is slow to change often. And so it's, by no means something that I would say, oh yeah, sure, we can, just get that fixed in, May. Especially as in this coming session as to who knows where the focus is going to be. But that's definitely something I can put together and mention to the external relations area.
Oh, I appreciate that. I wasn't sure if my phrase long-term was with a capital L or a lowercase L, but I knew that it was long-term period, at least something.
Yep.
Chad, this is Robert. I like the idea of maybe lowering it to one term, because that would mean that the student will be at our college for 2 years. Because after 2 years, they're looking to transfer to a 4-year. So if currently they're we pretty much forcing them to stay 3 years at our institution. But so it will require us to nominate a student every year. But I think if we lower the term to 1 year, we might be able to get some students to commit.
Yeah. And again, since that's a statutory requirement, in terms of our current requirement of holding a slot for the student from the 2-year, that would just be a rule change, which we can do relatively quickly in order to allow that other slot to be held by a member of the financial aid community. And then if a statutory change is successful, we can always adjust again accordingly, because the rules are much easier to change than statute is to change. Thomas?
Yeah, I'm very supportive of the concept of adjusting the rules and fulfilling that seat, particularly if we might be able to get another financial aid individual from a 2-year so that their voice can continue to be heard.
Great. So I'll rephrase my question as, is anyone opposed to us moving forward on a rule change that would no longer require a student representative from a 2-year institution? Hearing no comment, I will move forward with that adjustment. And then finally, my final item is just the overall update on activities in the Student Financial Aid Programs office. And in your handouts, what we did was the very first part of this agenda handout is recent rule activity. Recent rules, both rules that were adopted in August, as well as rules that were just recently proposed, which have a comment period that ends September 20th. So wanted you to be aware of those so that you could go to the Texas Register and look at any and comment on any that you feel might have particular information that would help us in considering those rules. Also wanted to just give you some recent announcements. This summer we did reduce the CAL interest rate to 4.2%. For loans that were certified on or after July 1st. I know the institutional calendar was recently released, as well as the new user access form. I remember Samantha mentioned during the data collection subcommittee that they were involved in helping provide feedback on that new user access to web portals form. A few upcoming deadlines that are occurring. One is the October 2nd deadline for the net price calculator under the current version. We had delayed that this year due to the pandemic and the move to working remotely and all the other challenges that you were facing. We felt that this was a lower priority than those other challenges. And so we launched that process this week for you to provide that information. And then the day after our next FAC meeting is the FAD deadline for reconciling your state program totals and to certify your student data. So just want to start getting that on your thought process. One piece about the FAD that we'll be providing some clarifying information for the FY20 FAD submission, is that any aid that you have provided that is excludable from estimated financial aid because it meets the conditions that the Department of Ed has set out when financial relief is being provided to victims of emergencies, that does not need to be reported on the FAD. So HERE funds don't need to be reported. FSEOG that you awarded using that emergency criteria to provide funding to students, that piece that you could use funds that you didn't have to follow the usual awarding piece, but you are awarding it as emergency. Anything that falls within that definition that the Department of Ed has provided of something that isn't considered estimated financial assistance doesn't need to be reported on the financial aid database. So no worries about having to make any extra changes or anything to get in, HERE funds or anything like that. Some things that we've done recently, back at the beginning of August, we launched the new online loan reporting tool. We used to have the online loan reporting and it had to be taken down due to security concerns, but we have now launched a new tool that addresses those security concerns and goes beyond the information that we used to provide. So the prior information is in there, and we expanded that information to provide you with borrower-specific details and things like that, which we feel, we hope will help with your reconciliation processes and things like that. And so I hope that that tool has been helpful for everyone, and please let us know if there are, other reports or adjustments to reports that you would like us to consider with that online loan reporting tool. We've also updated the SFAP webpage on the university or on the agency's website. We've reorganized that based on feedback from institutions, the data collection subcommittee in particular. And so some specific things we've done is added some webcast archives so that people can go back in the learning resources section and look at prior webcasts, and also integrated some information together so it's easier to find some of the information on the website. We also made some improvements for the borrowers on our loan website. We now have, it was updated, our whole system was updated to a mobile-friendly platform to help borrowers who might be accessing it through a tablet or a phone or something like that. We also made some improvements to, if they want to enroll in the automated monthly payment process, the ACH enrollment, we improved those screens to help them through that process and make it a little easier for them to understand. One of the programs that we have for individuals after they've completed coursework is the Peace Officer Loan Repayment Program, which was just launched 2 days ago, which provides an opportunity for peace officers who started their employment as a peace officer on or after September 1st, 2019, to earn $4,000 a year, up to $4,000, depending on what their debt balance is, up to $4,000 a year to help pay off their educational loans. This is the first year of that program, so that's added to some of the other loan repayment programs that we have for teachers and healthcare providers. And then obviously the biggest piece was the launch of the GEAR funding in the past few days. We've had over 36 contracts returned so far, so we're working to get those processed so we can just start dispersing funds out to the institutions. We did choose to make these disbursements in just one lump sum to institutions to make this easier for you all so that you didn't have to go through any process to submit anything, to request data. We wanted to provide you with the greatest flexibility as possible to just get you that money so that way you can have it and work with it during this fall semester. We are updating, the original contract that went out had some FAQs in it. Yesterday, we posted FAQs online that included those original FAQs and added more FAQs based on the questions that we had been receiving. And we intend on providing more FAQs as we hear back from organizations and institutions that if you have questions about it, anything that we can do to try to help explain the requirements so that you all can effectively administer that program. I want to give a big shout out to Deshae Reed and the entire financial aid services team. I know our accountants, Aaron Vicenice, Rafael Villarreal, as well as Joella Martinez, put in a lot of hours to get those contracts out to everyone. Sophia Rodriguez helped put together pretty much put together the website for the FAQs. That website is where we will also be placing reporting materials once we have those materials assembled for you to be able to report the monthly data as well as the closeout data. So that's a web page we will continue to update. I know Leah Smalley has been getting notices out to institutions about things through our Gov delivery. And I know others have been helping in the background as well. And I'm sure that you'll all be hearing from Troyling Johnson, as well as Michelle Fairbanks and Laura DeGrush on this as you ask questions about this. So very appreciative to the financial aid services team for getting this put together so quickly so that you all could have, our big goal was to make sure that you had these funds as quickly as possible once we received the money. And we only received the money a couple of weeks ago. So we wanted to turn it around and get it to you just as fast as we possibly could. That concludes my update. And so want to find out whether any of you have any questions for me about any of that. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chad. Okay. So the next item on the agenda is the transitional leadership. Well, first of all, I want to thank the members. Had been, for your support, and you've been awesome. I know we struggled to try to give meetings, but you've been provided great support, and also I want to thank Diane for being a great mentor. Chad, you and Michelle have been awesome. You have been providing support to get through the agenda already, and for me just to take over it. Thank you. I forgot to thank Leah Smiley earlier on the TASPA subcommittee, but she and her team were amazing at getting the TASPA PDF out within 3 weeks after receiving the TASPA, the FESPA updates. Okay, with that being said, now transfer the chair over to Ed. Ed, I don't have a gavel, so I'll give you a virtual gavel.
Oh, thanks for that. And it's interesting sitting in a meeting when you're saying, hey, the next time it's going to be me. But there'll be some time before our next meeting to kind of learn the ropes a little bit again from Robert and others. looking forward to some of the challenges that we have ahead and really the opportunities that we have ahead. There's a lot going on, and just in this meeting, a number of things that there'll be continued conversations on. So I guess with that, I'm not sure what my official duty is at this point, other than maybe adjourning the meeting. Is that correct, Chad?
That's correct.
Okay, I can do that. So unless there are any other items to discuss, looking for a proposal to adjourn this meeting.
This is Diane, so moved.
Any second?
This is Shannon, I'll second.
Okay, any opposition to wrapping this up and getting to lunch? I guess with none heard, we adjourn this meeting, and we'll be getting information about the next time we meet and how we'll meet, assuming it might be more like this than what we have done in the past, but who knows what's before us. But thanks for your time in this morning, and best of luck as you move into this holiday weekend. Hopefully you'll get some time to relax and enjoy versus work the whole weekend. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. You too.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, thank y'all.